Shalom everyone, welcome to another episode of the Hebrew and Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi, and this is the Haftarah for Parashat Bamidbar. I originally posted a discussion I did several years back on the book of Hosea, and decided to redo the recording for the purpose of actually doing a study that's mostly based on the Hebrew text, and less about the discussions that I had in these original recordings. This means that this recording is probably going to be a little bit shorter. If you do want to hear my series on Hosea, it is on the website in HebrewInIsrael.net. And the reason I originally posted the discussion instead of doing this type of podcast is because I had a very serious time constraint that prevented me from doing specific recordings, and I decided to what we can call a bonus round here and actually do another recording for Bamidbar, but actually do it a little bit later. So hopefully in the future this will be published as the regular one. But if you're listening to this when this is published, which is in 2019, this is more of a bonus round. Now, one of the very interesting things about Hosea, and you can go listen to the series that I did. The one interesting things about Hosea is we can call the prophet of love. He's considered to be a prophet that deals a lot with the concept of love, and there actually is a dispute in I'll call it the academic world regarding what kind of love is he specifically talking about here, because a lot of people see this as a love that has to do with what we would call emotional love, actual love that one person has to another, a man to his wife. In the case of Hosea, he is told to do certain actions which are very, very peculiar, and he still does them, and it's supposed to represent the love of God to Israel, that even though Israel had turned away from God, and when we say Israel, we're referring here specifically to the northern kingdom. That's the historical context of these prophecies. God, prefers to turn back to Israel and say, look, I want you back to be my wife. This is the metaphor that they use here. And Hosea is mostly understood as being a prophet that deals with love as ahava, as the actual emotion. The issue is that there's this discussion about the relationship between the concept of love here and the concept in the book of love in the book of Deuteronomy. So there's a bit of a dispute. Are Deuteronomy or Devarim and Hosea talking about the same concept, the concept of love as an emotion, or is Devarim talking about love in the sense of fidelity, of loyalty to your king, which is not necessarily an emotion, but more the concept of being loyal, being a subject who is loyal to his king, while Hosea is still talking about love in the sense of the emotion the person has towards their spouse. There are even people who want to move the concept of Devarim and Hosea being influenced by Devarim, or if you take the academics direction the other way around, Hosea is influencing Devarim, but that's documentary hypothesis that puts dates on certain things which most religious people would completely disagree with. I've actually seen attempts by religious scholars trying to explain why documentary hypothesis actually has helped them with their faith and so on. And I think that's a lot of rationalization. We need to understand that documentary hypothesis is one out of multiple possibilities which are discussed. You mostly hear documentary hypothesis, but it was actually the rug was pulled underneath its feet very, very quickly when Hermann Gunkel basically hypothesized something completely different, where he said, well, there's no original J, there was more oral information was written down later on. So there's a lot of these kind of type of discussions. So if you ever look up the concept of love in Hosea and Deuteronomy, you'll find discussions of this sort. My personal conclusion when I did the research on Deuteronomy, when I did my own research on Deuteronomy and the concept of Near Eastern literature, I concluded that the book of Deuteronomy is about the fidelity concept. It is a loyalty which can eventually develop into an actual emotion the person develops. But the first concept of loving God is, first of all, being loyal. Eventually, with correct education, a person can reach a point where they love God to an extent where it is an actual emotion. But how can you command someone to love Or how can you command someone to have an emotion? And it's a very, very difficult thing because, for example, people who have difficulty with emotions and things like that, it's very difficult to ask them to have an emotion towards God who they don't necessarily see in everything in their life. And some people have to undergo certain turmoils in life to see God, and some people have their life so comfortable that their approach towards God is very mechanical. So we need to understand, and I actually wrote an article about this, that the first stages is first of all show you loyalty. Be loyal to God, meaning keep His Torah, keep His commandments, keep everything that's said to us, and from there you develop, you work on yourself to develop a principle of faith that's also based on love. So the idea here is that God says, I have actual love towards you. I'm talking about Hosea. And Israel is supposed to show the same type of love after many generations of being together. If you ever get married, for example, in an arranged marriage, or if you get set up with someone. So, for example, when I got married, um, I didn't. I dated my wife for a very, very brief time, and we decided to get married because we understood that it would work. This was not what most Westerners would go through, where you meet a girl, you like her, you go out for a while, you're together for several months or several years, however it works, and you end up falling in love. When I got married, I couldn't say that I loved my wife in the sense that I love her today, because it's a different process. But today, my love to my wife is very, very deep. We've been together for almost 2 decades, so it's well, a little bit under 2 decades. But the concept is that these things develop. My mother, when I got engaged, my mother asked me on the phone, "But do you love her?" And I said, "I'll learn to love her." So Hosea comes from that place of many generations later. Deuteronomy, on the other hand, comes from a completely different place. He comes from the place of fidelity through loyalty, through recognizing that there's a loyalty here, that there's a mechanism that will allow these two people, will allow God and Israel, in the case of Deuteronomy, to develop this relationship, that you will see the loyalty that God has to Israel, and Israel will develop that emotion towards God by looking back into what happened, looking back into the history. This is why the history of God is really the history of His relationship with His people. Anything before that could be considered prehistory. So Hosea basically goes into this concept of, look, it's been several hundred years since the Exodus. We're at a point where your love towards God should be much more developed than just a nation that was just created in the time of the book of Deuteronomy. Even though you saw the great actions, it still takes time to develop that recognition of the sustenance that God gives Israel, and the recognition that He is loyal to us, and therefore He's proven Himself. Each generation is a little different, so it takes time, because someone can, for example, you think about it, someone can woo you with many things and then treat you very, very badly. And I unfortunately have heard of stories like this. Love is something that has to develop. It's something you have to invest yourself in. And this is what Hosea is saying. Hosea is saying, I've invested myself in you. Deuteronomy says the same thing, but Hosea is talking about this after many, many generations. And he says, God says, I invested myself in you. You should be loyal to me. I've shown my love to you. So eventually what we actually have here is a description of God complaining about Israel's behavior and saying, look, I've multiplied you, I've made you great, I've made you wonderful and very, very large, but you've abandoned me. You've become a harlot. You've walked away and you've been with other gods. It's like the concept of marriage. And if I'm not mistaken, there actually is a book called Marriage's Covenant. I can't remember who wrote it, but there's a book called Marriage's Covenant. Someone did a research on the subject. And in truth, the ketubah, for example, is a contract, but it's also a concept of covenant. That when I decide to marry my wife and my wife decides to marry me, we enter into a covenant where we are loyal to one another, that we share life with one another, that we bring children together into this world, that our blood carries on through our children. There's a really interesting book that deals with the concept of trying to understand loving God. I don't remember exactly who wrote it, but it was one of a reading requirement in philosophy class I took in high school. It's been 20 years, so I don't remember. But the rabbi who wrote this book asked a very simple question. He said, how can someone love something that they can't even see? So he says, you have to start from that point, those points of love that you have as a person in your own life. So as a child, it's your love to your parents. And as a young couple, it's the love you have that you share with your spouse. And then as a parent, it's the love you have that you have towards your children. And you use those concepts to reflect onto God. And from there, you can develop this concept. This is why God is presented as king and as father, and sometimes even as mother, and us as his children, and as his wife. All these metaphors, they all work into this concept of wanting to see God as our love in every possible dimension, aspect of the concept. So our reading specifically is going to be from Hosea 2:1 all the way to verse 22. And he says, "V'haya mispar b'nei Yisrael kachol hayam, asher lo yimad v'lo yisafer." The number of the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, meaning of the shore, which will not be measured or counted. Now, it's important to point out that he's not just talking about the future, he's talking about his present time. You're a pretty strong kingdom, or were a very strong kingdom, that the promise to Abraham was fulfilled. I've spoken about this concept of covenant, and in truth, I actually did with my Bible group, which is on Sundays. And if you're interested to ask questions about it, you can email me at hebrewinisrael@gmail.com. And you can see some details on the website. There's a few bits and pieces of recordings there as well. I've actually published stuff that was from this group as well. And I actually did, I think it was 2 sessions, so almost 3 hours of concepts of covenant and an introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. I spent several months researching the book of Deuteronomy just from the side of covenants, just researching that concept of covenants. And peer-reviewed as well. It was actually submitted to the university, yet to receive a grade so far. And the thing that came up was that the loyalty is proven by past actions. So when he says here, the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, this actually reminds us what God said to Abraham, that your children will be like the sand that no one can count, and like the stars. So there's a reference here to this. It says, "Vaya b'makom asher yoamer lahem lo ami atem, yamer lahem bnei el chai." Will be in the place where they were said to them, "You are not my people." This references back to chapter 1. We said to them, the sons of El Chai. Arguably, what this nominal construction means, but the living God. V'nikbetzu b'nei Yehuda uvnei Yisrael yachdav. The children of Judah will gather, and the children of Israel together. And this is actually a type of parallel where you have to complete the verb from the first limb. So it says, the children of Judah will gather, and the children of Israel will gather together. So the together belongs to what's before it and what's with it, and the verb will gather belongs to the way it's at and what's after it as well. ושמו להם ראש אחד, ועלו מן הארץ, כי גדול יום Israel. And they will place for themselves one head, meaning they will march together. One army, don't have to use tactics of breaking to different directions. We have it at least twice. Saul uses it. Gideon uses it as well, break up into 3 heads. And attack from different directions here, marching together as one group, basically like the Exodus. And they will rise up from the land, for the day of Israel is great. He's probably referencing the defeat, a defeat that happened in the valley of Israel. And he says Israel, together with Judah, not separately, together with Judah, will rise up to be powerful again. You have to understand this is also a period when the Assyrians were controlling the region and they were oppressing everyone. Parts of Israel were already scattered. And he declares, Imru la'achechem ami v'la'achotechem ruhama. Say to your brothers, my people, and to your sisters, one who receives mercy. Ruhama, rahum, mercy. Ruhama means one who is merciful, but really one who is loved. And then the complaint comes in. So it's built very similar to some of the concepts we have in Jeremiah. Jeremiah has complaints, but it's also framed a lot with information about love and caring. So now we have a very, very long series of complaints. And he says, look, the future is going to be good. But right now, this is what you're doing. Verse 4. Rivu bi'immechem rivu. Argue with your mother, argue. Riv is an old term for a legal argument. Ki hi lo ishti, va'anochi lo isha. For she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. V'taser zinunea mipanea, v'na'afufea miben shadeha. Let her remove her harlotry from before her, and her ni'uf, her adulterous behavior, between her breasts. Don't have to use too much imagination what he means here. He says to her, look, right now, this is not a bill of divorce. Right now, you're not behaving like my wife, and I can't be your husband because you're laying with other men. And so he says there's a threat here. Benafshitena aruma v'tzagtiha kiyom hivaleda. Lest I undress her to nakedness, and I will present her publicly to humiliate her as the day she was born. This reminds me a lot of prophecies from Ezekiel as well. There's a prophecy, I think it's chapter 16 or something like that. I think it relates either 16. Yeah, 16. I'm sorry. 3, 2, 1. So in chapter 16 of Ezekiel, he describes this reality as well, of being naked while being as born. And I'll place it like a desolate place, like the desert. Again, think of Ezekiel 16 about this. And I will place her like a dry land. And I will kill her with thirst. And her sons I will not show mercy, for they are children of harlotry. He says they're not my children. For their mother has harloted. She has behaved in a shameful manner. The one who bore them, birthed them. Ki amera lecha harema ahavai, notne lachmi umemai, samri ufishti shamni v'shikuyai. For she said, I will go after my lovers, the ones who give me my bread and water, my wool and my linen, my oils and my potions. So he says to her, therefore I lay your pathway with thorns. And I will put a fence upon her. And her pathways she will not find. I'm not too sure exactly what he's referring to here specifically, but he might be talking about the Assyrian, what's known as the Pax Assyriana, the Assyrian peace that brought a certain level of prosperity to the land, but with the price of abandoning the God of Israel. So he's talking about the bread and specifically the oil and the potions, basically the trade that was going on at the time. So he says, I'll block this pathway. I will block the ways that lead from Assyria to here and all the prosperity that you got, because the prosperity is not worth anything unless you're with me. He says in verse 9, V'ridefa et ma'ahavea ve'lo tasigotam, uvikashatam ve'lo timtza. And she will chase down her lovers, but will not reach them. And she will seek them and not find. Ve'amera elecha ve'ashuva el ishi harishon, ki tov li az me'ata. And she would say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was good for me then than now. So eventually what's going to happen is the realization that you cannot find true prosperity without the God of Israel. It only looks like prosperity, but eventually it's going to bring doom. Verse 10, V'hi lo yade'a ki anochi natati lah hadagan v'hatirosh v'yitzar. And she did not know that I gave her the grain and the grapes and the oil, or the grain, the wine and the oil. So that she didn't know, it says she didn't care. To know does not necessarily have to do with knowledge of data, of details. It's more about the of understanding, of realizing something. He says, "V'chesef herbeti lah v'zahav asu laba'al," and silver I increased for her, and gold they made for the Baal. He's really saying everything that I gave to them, the grain, the wine, the oil, the silver, the gold, it was all given to Baal. Not understanding, not really comprehending where it really came from. And he says, therefore, as a result, Lachen ashuv elakachti degani be'ito v'tiroshi b'mo'ado. Therefore, I will take my grain at its time and my wine at its appointed time. So it's not a mo'ed as a feast day. What he's saying is when you're supposed to have these items, grain. Right now, for example, I'm recording this just before Shavuot, so the feast of the grains. And the tirosh really refers to the end of summer, when you make your wine. So the beginning of harvest and what's mostly the end of the harvest. And I will save, meaning I will take it away and reserve it to myself, my wool and my linen, to cover her nakedness. Now I will reveal her shame, her shameful behavior before the eyes of her lovers. And no one will save her from my hand. Vishbati kol masosa, chaga, hodsha, v'shabata, v'chol mo'ada. And I will cease, I will stop. So the word Shabbat, lehashbit, means to actually stop something. All her joy. Her chagah. Now, chag, many translate this as a holiday or feast day or something. I actually looked up some interesting details. Levinson, for example, suggests that chag really means pilgrimage. Chodsha is the new moon. Shabbatah is the Sabbath. V'chol mo'adah, and all her feast, which means all her feasts. So there's actually a very clear separation here between the concept of Chodesh and Shabbat. I actually wrote an article, which I don't think I published yet, but it deals with the question of was the Shabbat, was the moon part of the cycle of the Shabbat? And the conclusion is that it's not. There's no connection whatsoever. No actual real calendral detail proves anything about a connection between the new moon and the Shabbat. Only scholars who want to argue that there's a connection between the Babylonian Shabbatum and the biblical Shabbat would agree that there's some kind of a connection. But when you read the actual sources that talk about the 7-day cycle, they don't recognize anything like that. And the 7-day cycle is completely detached from the moon. This is why the moon is only created on the 4th day and not on the 1st day to produce, or it's not created on the 7th day to produce a concept that there's a separation. Now, one would argue, well, if the moon was created on the 4th day, maybe it was only revealed 3 days later. Well, there's no thing, meaning Wednesday or 4th day, 5th day, 6th day, and on the 7th day, suddenly it was the new crescent. But that's 4 days from creation, which means even if it was dark, it should appear at least 1 or 2 days later. So there's a lot of issues here when people argue lunar Sabbath. It's also important to point out that the concept of the lunar Sabbath, the way it's structured, is identical to the Shabbatum. So people who follow that are basically following a Babylonian calendar, but they tend to say that what Jews do is either Roman, which there's no proof of that whatsoever, because the Romans had an 8-day calendar. It's a completely different concept. But the concept of starting the month and the Shabbat on the 1st day, and then the 7th day, or the 1st day and then the 8th day, and then 14 or 15, and then 21 or 22, and then 28 or 29. This is actually a Babylonian calendar concept called the Shabbatum, and there's a lot to discuss about that. And it says in verse 14, "Vashimoti gafnah vete'enatah," and I will make desolate her vines and her figs. Asher amira etena hem mali, asher natenu li ma'avai, which I give to myself, meaning I will consume them, which my lovers gave to me. Vesamtim layar v'achalatam hayat hasadeh, I will put them as a forest, meaning something which is not protected. Figs and vine and so on, these are things which are agricultural developments. He says, there will be like a forest that wild animals can eat them. And he says the wild animals will consume them. And I will appoint upon her the days of the Baalim, of the Baals. So there were multiple gods called Baal, which she burnt incense to them, or I even can say burnt offerings to them. ותעד נזמח בחלייתה, ותלך אחרי מאהביה, ואותי שכחה נאום אדוני. And she wore her nezem. Nezem can be an earring or a nose ring. Vechilata seems more to be an arm ring of some sort. And she followed after her lovers, and she forgot me, says the Lord. So he says, Lachen hini anochi mefateha, therefore, behold, I am going to seduce her. V'holachtiha bamidbar, v'dibarti al libah. I will lead her to the desert, and I will speak to her heart. The concept of the desert here is returning to the time of the Exodus, the time that's before the creation of the cities, before Israel had kings, to a time where Israel was young. ונתתי לה את כרמיה משם, ואת עמק אחור לפתח תקווה. I will give to her her vineyards from there, and the valley of desolence of Achor, to an opening of hope. וענתה שמה כימי נעוריה. So there's a question here, וענתה. The root ana is a bit difficult here. Does it mean that she will sing like in the days of her youth? וכיום עלותך מארץ מצרים, and that is the day she came out from the land of Egypt? Is that the concept here? Like the song on the sea? Or does it mean that she will submit herself? Right, realizing that I'm the power. And there's a big question here, which ayin is being used here, the or the ra. You can't really hear it when you hear it of a recording, but there's a bit of a difference between these two roots. And both can work here. The question is, what was the original pronunciation? Was it aneta or aneta? It's a good question. Both work, by the way, because it can be that she will humble herself because of what she saw, or that she sang praise because of what she saw. I would say the context probably talks more about ana with an a, which means that this is more about humbling. Vaya vayom hahu neum Adonai tikri'i ishi velo tikri'i li od ba'ali. And on that day, on that day, says the Lord, you will call me Ishi, my man, and you will no longer call me Ba'ali, my husband. The concept here is the word Ish versus Baal. We no longer use the word Baal anymore because it reminds us of the name of this pagan god that they followed. And he says in verse 19, "Vasiroti et shemota be'alim mipiha velo yizachru od bishmam." And I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they will not be mentioned anymore by name. The root zachar also means to mention. So there's this whole question: what is the concept of B'Shem Elohim acherim lo tazkir? You will not mention the name of other gods. There's a big debate about this. Here, he wants to completely remove the names, but the understanding is that not mentioning names of other gods really has to do with using their names in oaths. Another very interesting discussion. And I will cut to them a covenant on that day. So it's an interesting concept, to cut a covenant. Karat means to cut. This comes from the background of cutting animals into pieces when they used to do covenants. But the word berit actually has to do probably with the concept of tying a knot. So cutting a tying. But this really plays off of the two realities. That on one hand, when they did covenants, animals were cut into pieces. And the cutting of the animal into pieces was a symbolic concept of if you, it was a, I can't remember exactly what the term is, but it's to transfer identity from the person to the animal. If someone breaks the covenant, what happened to the animal will happen to them. But also when you do a covenant, you're bonding to one another. You're tying yourself to one another as well. So it says, on that day I will cut a covenant to them, a covenant with them. With the animals of the field and the birds of the heavens and the swarms of the earth. It's really interesting that he mentions these things, because he does mention the animals earlier. So probably the concept is that the land will be at peace with Israel, and the animals will not harm Israel, as a counter to what was said earlier. וקשת וחרב ומלחמה אשבור מן הארץ, וישכבתם לבטח. And a bow and a sword and war I will break from the land, meaning there will be no longer danger of enemies. And they will lie down peacefully. Then he says here 3 sentences, which are said every day when a Jew puts on the phylacteries. When you put tefillin on, you wrap around the middle finger. And we treat it as if it's a wedding ring. To this very day, when you get married, in Judaism, usually what happens is you put a ring on the finger. Now, really, in truth, rings is an adoption from something from other nations as well. Originally, you could do a marriage with nothing else. Today, usually, what happens is you use the index finger to put the ring. But because the index finger is uncomfortable to wrap around, we usually wrap around the middle finger. And it's done in 3 stages. You do 3 wraps around the fingers. And there's different customs on the middle. On the middle knuckle, you do 1. The knuckle that's close to your hand, you do 3. Some people do 2 on the middle knuckle, 1 on the one next to your hand. Some people wrap around in each section. We have a custom to do 3 just on the knuckle that's next to your hand. There's different practices. It doesn't really matter. But it developed throughout time, because originally, the original practice was to wrap the phylactery just on your arm, do 1 or 2 wraps around the forearm, and just go with the finger and wrap around there, and that's it. Today it's much more elaborate, but the concept here is as if every time we put the phylacteries on, we're putting on a symbol of our connection to God, our marriage to God. It says, Va'arastich li le'olam. The root arasi is to betroth, but also to marry. And I will betroth you or marry you for forever, for eternity. Va'arastich li betzedek uv'mishpat uv'chesed uv'rachamim. I will betroth you to me with justice and righteousness, or justice and mishpat, which is the concept here is more of an abstract idea of doing justice. and with favor and mercy. V'arastichli be'emunah v'yadati et Adonai. And I will betroth you to me with faith, with emunah, but not faith in the sense of what people say today faith, but with loyalty. And he will know the Lord. They didn't know me here, but they will know me in the future. So this is a supplement to complete the actual textual discussion of the Hebrew. This is a very, very powerful message. There's always a way to resolve issues. There's always a way to fix these issues. God waits there for us to return to him, to come forward and say to him, we're here. We want to be with you. So even if we break the covenant, there's always a way to come back. Even if we've forgotten who we are, we can always remember. So if we forget, all we have to do is turn around back to him and say, we're trying to return now. So I hope you enjoyed this recording. As I said, this will be a relatively shorter one, but I did want to put out something with the actual Hebrew text and some short discussions. I do know that I said there's a few very interesting discussions here about what is emunah, how the covenants work, and a few other details, the Shabbat. These are all things that I've addressed in other places as well. And you can go there and read and listen to these recordings. I hope to publish the ones about Deuteronomy very, very soon. And if these recordings have helped you, please consider helping Hebrew in Israel. These recordings are put out for free. And even though I do not expect anyone to give anything, it does help. It helps getting research material. It helps cover time for the research itself. Instead of doing my day job to research these things, I can take less hours out of work. But that's not the main point. The main point is to study, learn, understand, get a better grasp of what the Hebrew text is saying and what the context is. So thank you for joining me again. And I hope that this has filled in some gaps that might exist from the original Haftarah podcast that I put out for Bamidbar. Kol Tov.